Hey, good morning. Let's do this. Okay. So today is June 10th, 2025. And if you've followed me for any time at all, or you've seen things that I have written, perhaps you've caught an interview that I've done here or there, maybe a Substack that I've written, then you may be roughly aware of a little bit of my background. And if you're not, that's totally okay too. I wouldn't expect you to be. There's not necessarily any reason why you would be. But if you are, then you might know that June 10th is a significant day for me. And if you don't know why that is, then again, there's no reason why you would. So, um, I was in the military for a long time. I ended up resigning from the military over the COVID shot mandate. But what happened prior to my resignation was I was a commander of a battalion in the Army, and I was fired from that position because I refused to go along with the COVID op. So anyway, long story short. So I had taken command of this battalion in the Army on June 10th, 2021. So exactly 4 years ago. So in that regard, over the last couple of years, when June 10th comes around, it's kind of like, oh yeah, I remember when I became a battalion commander today and how I knew in the day of, during the change of command ceremony in which I became the new commander, I knew that I'm probably not going to be here for very long because the writing is on the wall. The DoD is going to implement this mandate very, very soon, because at that point it was not in effect yet, but it would be a couple of months later. And so I knew the writing was on the wall, and I knew that very shortly I would probably be removed from command. And within about 4.5 months, that happened. Okay, so June 10th, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. And so this is a significant day, but as we're talking through this today, I want you to understand I'm kind of tired of talking about this. And for people who've heard me tell the story over and over, they're tired of hearing it. And I totally get it. So it's not about me. It's not about me. If I'm talking about me, it's because I'm using my case of what happened to me and as an example of what happened to many, many other people. And I'm letting you know there are people in charge of our military who either have no idea what is going on in our country or are complicit to some degree in it, whether um, to a great degree or to a small degree, but they are complicit in it. Some wittingly, many unwittingly, but it's important that you understand that. And so today we're going to talk about what it means to be in command in the military, and we're going to talk about kind of what I would call um, this current paradox of military command, and I'm going to explain to you why I feel that way. So again, it's not about me. It's about just using what happened to me, and the reason that I talk about it is because, um, I mean, it happened to me, so I'm familiar with what happened to me. So it's the case that I'm the most familiar with. But we can then take that and we can apply that to many, many other people, not just in the military, but many other people in other parts of society or wherever, within our country that have been similarly affected. But also, there has to be a forward looking aspect to this. We don't just focus on the past because we can't move on. We focus on the past because we can't move on until we reconcile what has happened. We acknowledge it, and there's some sort of concerted effort to correct what has happened and ensure that it never happens again. Um, when you anyway, so let's just talk about the piece a little bit. Um, and I want you to, as you think about what's happening in our military, um, I want you to understand why I think it's so important that we focus on military commanders, because commanders are those are the most important positions within the military. Okay. And the military is very open about that. And of course it is. Of course, commanders are the most important positions in the military, those command billets. I mean, they're the ones who ultimately run the military. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay. So I'm going to read something for you that I wrote between last night and this morning. All right. So 4 years ago, June 10th, 2021, I assumed command of a battalion in the Army, specifically within the 101st Airborne Division. It was a special moment. marking years of hard work and dedication in the Army. So at the point that I took command, I had about, I would have had 18 years. I ended up serving a total of 19 years by the time that, everything kind of, worked itself out in terms of my getting fired, then resigning, etc. But at the time that I took command, I was at 18 years. Okay. So a special moment. However, the special nature of the moment was completely overshadowed by the looming conflict that would soon emerge between the position of command and the mantle of command. This paradox would be framed by the idea that those commanders who truly understood their command responsibilities and stood firm be removed from their command roles, whereas those who demonstrated a poor comprehension of their roles or a willingness to compromise that which must never be compromised would remain in their command positions and in many cases would subsequently be rewarded. Stated another way, the fact that any current commanders are presently in their position or have been in command positions over the last few years, with very few exceptions, is evidence alone that they do not understand their role and don't measure up to the requirements of a commander. If they were, if they did understand their role, or if they did measure up, they could. There wouldn't be, or they wouldn't be in those positions. They would have been removed, or their careers would have been derailed over the past few years, making them ineligible for a command position, which are the most distinctive and prestigious in the military. And I would say, rightfully so, about the command positions. In my case, I would be relieved of command in October 2021 for not complying with the COVID shot mandate implemented in August. So I took command in June, mandate comes out in August. By the end of October, I'm already, out of command. This is the same mandate that the Secretary of Defense now openly admits was unlawful. The mandate was not only unlawful, but also significantly destructive to military readiness. Command positions are the most important billets in the military. Commanders drive the operations process. They own every aspect of the unit's readiness. They're ultimately responsible for what their units do or fail to do. They're also their unit's first advocate. They appropriately receive credit when their units exceed expectations and take the appropriate blame when their units fail to meet standards. When options are weighed as to which units should receive particularly difficult mission sets, unit commanders are taken into account. The military doesn't need commanders who only do the right thing when it's obvious what the right thing to do is. The military needs skilled commanders to make tough decisions when it's difficult to know what to do. The military doesn't need commanders who lack the strategic ability to understand a complex environment, assess the interactions between the variables within that environment, recognize valid threats, and then make sound decisions. So here's I'm kind of deviating a little bit from what I was reading because I also want to say here the military doesn't need commanders who lack the integrity to comply with their oaths to support and defend the Constitution, follow the law, or defend the nation from threats. And yet, that is exactly what we have. Those are the types of commanders that we have, sadly enough. Our military currently suffers from this crisis in command precisely because we prioritize institutional conformity even over that which we pretend to be sacrosanct, namely the Constitution and the country. Even the military's own leaders no longer take the Constitution seriously. Why? Because they're rewarded for ignoring their oaths. When the military implements new policies, commanders enforce them. That means that when, not if, the military implements new unlawful policies once again, it will be the commanders up and down the chain who will enforce them. Recent past experience demonstrates that the overwhelming majority of these commanders will push these policies, even if unlawful, so long as they are given a plausible enough reason to do so, coupled with the belief that they won't be held accountable for it. The military can't be trusted unless significant changes are made both to DoD and the government as a whole, and the necessary changes aren't even being currently considered. If the military were serious about instituting the proper changes, which it isn't, it must start by selecting commanders that believe in doing the right thing because it's the right thing. Personal consequences be damned. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to talk, or I'm going to go over here to this piece that I wrote 2 years ago called Moral Injury. Now, if you don't know what moral injury is, I'm not going to talk about it here because I'll probably do a video on moral injury, but I would invite you to read this piece because I'm actually not going to focus today on the moral injury piece. That deserves its own treatment. So we'll talk about that another day because it is an important one, and we'll return to this piece where we can give it its due consideration. So today I'm going to go a little bit further down, and I'm going to just kind of explain some stuff that pertains to moral injury, but that's not why we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about leadership, and then we're going to talk about leadership specifically when it comes to command. And we're going to build on what I just read. And some of the thoughts will sound a little bit familiar because there are some thoughts that are similar between what I just expressed and what we're going to go over here. Okay, so the widespread moral injury in the military has real discernible effects. If you want to know more about moral injury specifically, I'll put the link to this piece in the description. You can come read this. It constitutes a significant strategic problem. Indeed, it may in fact be the greatest strategic problem our military currently faces because of the impacts on overall readiness. I have been emphatically clear about my beliefs on the entire COVID operation. I have written about it here, and I give a link to where I've written more about the COVID operation. Remember, I wrote this piece about 2 years ago. I believe it was intentionally designed to destroy our own military, both through the direct adverse effects, physical injury, as well as the corresponding moral injury that would assuredly occur on a massive scale. Warfighting is a complex endeavor. It is more than just strategy and tactics. It's also more than just the total number of soldiers, guns, tanks, and bombs. These are all certainly important, and very smart people spend endless hours drawing up detailed plans of action, considering many of these quantitative factors to achieve certain end states. We actually talked a little bit about this in the piece that I did on D-Day. Anyway, however, there are always other factors at play that are also immensely important. Warfare is, after all, a human endeavor, and morality is a significant component of that human dimension. To demonstrate why, let me refer to the branch of service with which I am the most familiar, the Army. While the intricacies of doctrine differ between the various services, the fundamental concepts behind those doctrinal specifics will apply across the board. I am going to cite a few examples from Army manuals, but please understand that the problems affect the entire military. In doing so, I will describe a few of the key factors caused by moral injury that now contribute to this massive strategic problem that the Department of Defense plans to ignore. All organizations operate on trust. In some organizations, trust may be more important than others. In the military, due to the nature of its charter, trust is of paramount importance. An erosion of trust can have severe effects on the ability of a unit to carry out its assigned missions. Trust must be operative in both directions. A leader must trust that his subordinates will act within the leader's, stated intent. The subordinates must trust the leader's character enough to feel that he is doing his best to maintain the optimal balance between mission accomplishment and the subordinates' well-being. The complexity of today's operations, coupled with the vastness of the modern battlefield, require enormous levels of mutual trust. Nothing is more corrosive to trust than moral injury. Without trust, leadership can never be effective. Leadership is the most important facet in determining success in war, and militaries around the world have known this for a long time. The American military is no different. In Field Manual 3-0, Operations, on page 2-4, the Army has this to say: leadership is the most essential dynamic of combat power. The same manual goes on to explain that leadership is the multiplying and unifying dynamic of combat power, and it represents the qualitative difference between units. Above, I mentioned that warfare is not so simple as to be entirely decided in quantitative terms. And again, we actually spoke about this in the D-Day piece when we were kind of going through some of what it means to plan complex operations, etc. Anyway, there are many other intangible qualities that are vitally important, and leadership has long been recognized as the most supreme. Why exactly is leadership so deterministic in unit success? The Operations Field Manual, mentioned above, explains that leadership is crucial because it inspires individuals to push past their perceived breaking point and to fight for their unit and fellow soldiers under the most difficult circumstances. The Army even has its own specific leadership manual, which goes into more detail on this integral component of success. In providing some contextual background to the Army's philosophy on leadership, Army Doctrine Publication 6-22, entitled Army Leadership in the Profession, on page 1-6, provides the following description of the Army ethic. And I will say, just pause real quick, that I have actually spoken about this Army ethic before in a recent video. The Army ethic is the set of enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws that guide the Army profession and create the culture of trust essential to Army professionals in the conduct of missions, performance of duty, and all aspects of life. On page 1-8 of the same manual, several expectations of the Army profession are found. Several of these are listed below. 1. Honorable service in defense of the Constitution and the interests of the American people. Number 2, bonds of trust with the American people. If leadership is so important within the American military, and if true leadership is so heavily predicated upon character, ethics, and culture, then why in the past 2 years, now I wrote this 2 years ago, so more like 4 years now, have we witnessed perhaps the single largest leadership failure in the history of our military? We have observed virtually all uniformed leaders shirk their duties and shun the truth by going along with these deliberately harmful policies rather than risk harm to their reputations, careers, or livelihood. While I acknowledge the challenges inherent in standing up against tyranny, it is excruciatingly painful to watch the military destroy itself. This pain we feel in observing this destruction is moral injury. How come virtually every leader across our military still refuses to stand up and speak out against the injustices continuing to occur? How can these leaders convince themselves that they are supporting and defending the Constitution as they continue to permit the injustices caused by the mandate to persist? How can these leaders convince themselves that they are acting in the best interest of the American public? Now, let me pause right there to say that even though, there's been this change of administration or whatever, and there's a new Secretary of Defense, I get it. All these problems still persist. Okay, let us not be confused and think that all these problems have somehow, magically been fixed. They have not. I realize that there's been some window dressing that has kind of been performed. And I do get people who approach me all the time, and they approach me and ask me these questions because they totally believe that all these problems have been fixed. They haven't. They completely still persist. All right. Anyway, let's get back to the reading. Regardless of the mental gymnastics performed by these individuals, many of them have to be internally conflicted about the situation they have found themselves in. What they need to realize is that while they are also victims of moral injury, many of them are also perpetrators, and that continuing to deny the realities of the harm caused will not fix the situation. We expect much more from our leaders. The Army itself states unequivocally that leaders are responsible for understanding the context in which orders are given. Leaders don't receive a pass for merely passing down orders from higher without questioning those that may be potentially unsound. Leaders don't get a pass because they think they are too busy to actively weigh the overall validity of orders they receive with the intent of passing them down. Army Doctrine Publication 6-22 explains on page 2-7 that the Army expects that its leaders understand they have a responsibility to research relevant orders, rules, and regulations, and to demand clarification of orders that lead to criminal misinterpretation or abuse. With the huge question marks and red flags surrounding the COVID-19 injection mandate, leaders have zero excuses for failing to speak out in the 20 months since its implementation. Now, obviously, it's been much more than 20 months by now. Ignorance is no excuse. Additionally, the fact that the mandate has been officially repealed does not obviate the responsibility for these leaders to speak out. After all, the physical and moral effects of the mandate continue to be felt and will be for far into the future. At this point, every single leader across DoD that has gone along with the mandates and their aftermath without resisting is complicit in the ongoing destruction of the military. This means that they are complicit in the moral injury that continues to be perpetrated against service members and the public. Leadership is considered to be so important that leadership training begins very early on in the candidacy of any prospective officer, regardless of commissioning source. In my case, it was the primary focus of my 4 years at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Everything centered around leadership development. West Point states that its mission is to educate, train, and inspire the Corps of Cadets so that each graduate is a commissioned leader of character, committed to the values of duty on our country, and prepared for a career of professional excellence and service to the nation as an officer in the United States Army. Now, a quick point, because I wrote this 2 years ago. So about a year ago, there was this controversy at the Academy about them removing the words duty on our country from the mission statement, but it's still the motto. I've spoken a ton about that. I spoke about it in a recent video. I've also written a Substack on it, but just wanted to make that note here. So that mission statement might actually be slightly different than what I wrote, but you get it in terms of the leadership. You get what they're trying to say. The entire Army prides itself on its dedication and adherence to its overarching organizational standard known as the Army values. Those values are listed below with a select portion of each of the corresponding descriptions offered on the Army Values website. Added to each, I have included my own commentary as it relates directly to a violation of that specific value and its corresponding strategic impact. I'm not going to read through these. You guys, if you want to read this piece, you can read how I go through the Army values and basically say leaders in the Army aren't living up to these, which of course is true. Okay, next section, crisis of command. This is why we're here. The most severe type of leadership failure we have witnessed all across the military at all echelons has been the extreme cowardice of commanders. Command billets are the most important positions across the military. I believe I said that a couple minutes ago. Simply stated, commanders are responsible for what their units accomplish or fail to accomplish. I said that too. They can appropriately be commended when their unit exceeds expectations and can appropriately bear the brunt of criticism when their unit fails to perform to standard. I said that earlier, but, it bears repeating. Army Regulation 600-20, entitled Army Command Policy, explains what it means to command on page 2. Command is exercised by office and a special assignment of members who are eligible to exercise command. A commander exercises command authority over a military organization or a prescribed territorial area. The manual then explains that a commander is responsible for all aspects of unit readiness. The military takes selections of its commanders extremely seriously because of the responsibility inherent to the position, regardless of the level of command. This is evident in the Army's recent decision to radically alter its process for selecting its battalion commanders. I happened to be in the first year group of eligible command candidates to participate in the new Battalion Commander Assessment Program and found it a worthwhile experience. I genuinely believed that the Army was striving to improve its mechanism for placing the right individuals in one of its most important positions, that of battalion commander. However, having witnessed the total command failure in the wake of the COVID-19 injection mandate, I believe the character deficit within our pool of otherwise eligible commanders was so great that even BCAP, the Battalion Commander Assessment Program, could not correct it. Having been a commander in the Army, I expect a lot out of the officers that bear the highest responsibility of anyone in uniform. No commander is perfect. No commander gets everything right. There are many types of mistakes that even for commanders are completely tolerable. Even commanders learn and improve during the time in which they are in command. However, there are also actions that for a commander are entirely intolerable. If putting oneself above the unit and the mission is intolerable, putting oneself above the Constitution and the country is unconscionable. No one is more responsible for the implementation of the shot mandate and its impact than commanders. Not the military doctors, not the military lawyers, not the military chaplains. All three of those groups bear responsibility as well, and the overwhelming majority of them shirked their duties too. There's plenty of cowardice to go around, but no group bears more responsibility for the current state of moral injury across the Department of Defense and the nation than the commanders. So if you're currently in command or you've been in command the last couple of years, I'm talking to you. Commanders who are unwilling to challenge their superiors on potentially unsound orders are unworthy of the title commander. It is true that in the military, one must follow orders. One may not willfully disobey an order merely because one disagrees with it. One is free to openly discuss misgivings of the order with the issuing authority, assuming time and circumstances permit, but one may not simply disregard an order due to a disagreement with its operational soundness or because it seems like a bad idea. Army Regulation 600-20, Army Command Policy, makes that clear on page 27. All personnel in the Army are required to strictly obey and promptly execute the legal orders of their lawful seniors. This expectation, which is entirely appropriate given the military's nature, has one significant qualifier. Army Doctrine Publication 6-22, Army Leadership in the Profession, includes an exceptionally important section called Ethical Orders on page 2-8. These few paragraphs are some of the most crucial contained in any doctrinal manual of any type. All right, hold on. I just lost my place. Just as we were about to get to the good stuff. Okay, this expectation, which is entirely appropriate given the military's nature, has one significant qualifier. The Army Doctrine Publication 6-22, Army Leadership in the Profession, includes an exceptionally important section called Ethical Orders on page 2-8. These few paragraphs are some of the most crucial contained in any doctrinal manual of any type. Here we learn that the Army fully recognizes that there may be times when the situation requires a leader to stand firm and disagree with a supervisor on ethical grounds. These occasions test one's character and moral courage. Situations in which any Army member thinks an order is unlawful can be the most difficult. I'm going to read that again because that is a direct quote. Here we learn that the Army fully recognizes that there may be times when, quote, so I'm quoting Army Doctrine Publication 6-22, entitled Army Leadership in the Profession. I'm quoting, quote, the situation requires a leader to stand firm and disagree with a supervisor on ethical grounds. These occasions test one's character and moral courage. Situations in which any Army member thinks an order is unlawful can be the most difficult, unquote. The manual goes on to explain that, quote, unlawful orders are the exception. A leader has a duty to question such orders and refuse to obey them if clarification of the order's intent fails to resolve objections, unquote. I'm going to read that again because remember, there are many people out there in the military who clearly do not understand this. The manual goes on to explain that, quote, unlawful orders are the exception. A leader has a duty to question such orders and refuse to obey them if clarification of the order's intent fails to resolve objections, unquote. What does this mean? Simply stated, this means that if you fail to resist an unlawful order, then you have failed in your duty. You have failed in your duty. So for those of you out there who are commanders or who were commanders and you went along with this mandate because you had neither the brains to understand what was happening or the balls to stand up and resist it, you are unworthy of your position as a commander. You have desecrated that position by failing in your duty to stand up and resist this tyranny. You turned your back on the Constitution that you had taken an oath to support and defend. If you had any dignity whatsoever, you would resign. Turning to the piece here. I fully acknowledge here that many leaders were perhaps true believers in the mandate policy when it came out. Their poor decision-making at that time could be attributed more to naivete than cowardice. That deficit in critical thinking has had disastrous strategic effects, and commanders don't get off the hook by merely being considered naive. Itself a massive indictment of their abilities, though perhaps not of their character. Regardless of their possible, and I'm going to just say right here, naivete also, lack of intellect or cognitive ability to understand the environment and recognize true threats also disqualifies you for being a commander in the military, or at least it should. Regardless of their possible beliefs or intentions, in August 2021, when the mandate was implemented, it is impossible for commanders to remain naive now. And I wrote this 2 years ago. Where have you been? Those of you who cared more about your careers, your precious title of commander, than what was going on in the country, where have you been the last couple of years? What do you think when you look in the mirror and realize the cold gray eyes of a coward are staring back at you? Too much information has come out in the past 20 months, now much longer, for these individuals to continue to claim ignorance. Any ignorance at this point is willful, and willful ignorance stems from cowardice. If you're afraid to look into what's going on because you're afraid of what you discover, then you are afraid of the truth, and you don't deserve to be a commander in the military. And then I go on to say, at this point, commanders should be thoroughly investigating what they were a part of the past 2 years. Now I would say 4. And fixing it. And here's the deal. We're talking about the COVID shot mandate, but we're also not talking about the COVID shot mandate. We're talking about how this happened in the military and those that allowed it to happen, and how it's these exact same individuals that will allow this to happen again if we allow them to allow it. to happen again. And there's been no true effort to root these weak commanders out and fix our system of selecting commanders. Fixing the fact that we don't have any senior leaders who will actually support and defend the Constitution according to the oaths that they have taken. That's why this is so important. We're not just talking about the COVID shot mandate. It is much, much bigger than that. That's the occasion of why I wrote this piece, etc. But it's much bigger than that. It's about, well, what comes next? What are they potentially setting the stage for now? What is the military going to be a part of for the next phases of the tyranny that are ongoing? All right, returning to the piece. Feeling internally conflicted isn't enough. Being a victim of moral injury isn't sufficient justification for also being a perpetrator. No commander should expect command to be easy. Candidates are not selected for command because of their ability to make the right decision when it's obvious what to do. Commanders are necessary because it's not always obvious what the right answer is. Commanders are expected to weigh competing requirements and make decisions amid limited resources. Commanders are expected to fully understand risk and balance that against opportunity. Commanders are expected to operate under time constraints and with incomplete information. They are expected to exercise sound judgment. A commander who is only capable of making the right decision when it's easy to do is no commander at all. There is a grand paradox of command at play here. Those few who truly understood the mantle of command had to have the courage to stand up for truth and the Constitution and thus be willing to lose their command. Whereas the cowards who sought to protect their positions, their precious title of commander at all costs, demonstrated they have no right to command America's sons and daughters. As a commander who was relieved for refusing to go along with the mandate, I feel well within my rights to call out my own. I also feel that my peer group, battalion commanders, could have stopped the mandate. But 99% of you were too weak to do so. That's not actually written there. I just added that in now. Had more brigade and battalion commanders stepped up and resisted the unlawful and willfully destructive mandate, there is no way it could have remained in effect. Even if all our generals and admirals across the entire military have lost their way, and they may have, colonels and lieutenant colonels, or the corresponding ranks of captain and commander in the Navy that are in command billets could have stopped this in its tracks. Sadly, the overwhelming majority of colonels and lieutenant colonels have also lost their way. We are surely suffering from a leadership disaster, but part of that disaster is a total crisis of command. To understand who bears the largest burden for this moral injury and the corresponding strategic destruction, look no further than those who proudly display the signs outside their offices designating themselves as commander. I don't know that our military can be salvaged. I'm not ready to declare that it can't be, but if it is to be saved, it can only happen with massive changes. These changes must be so sweeping as to be nearly, but perhaps not totally, impossible. Anyone who thinks otherwise is deluded. It might be possible, but it will be incredibly difficult. Having said that, there's always hope. There's no reason to give up and allow our country to collapse, as will surely happen if we continue along the present trajectory. To save the country, we will need to save the military. The current military is a threat to Americans rather than their defenders. That's obvious to anyone who has looked at what the Department of Defense's leaders have done the last few years. We have a massive strategic problem that must be fixed. The primary reason to fix it is because it's the right thing to do, but it's also necessary. Whatever our shortcomings may be in terms of military technology, hardware, intelligence capabilities, etc., we remain morally incapable of defending ourselves. Advantages in other areas will not outweigh the strategic obstacles caused by our current moral void. How do we even attempt to fix this? There must be some sense of atonement. When I make the claim that we have massive numbers of disenchanted service members and their families, I am merely suggesting that they feel massively wronged. My point here is not to proclaim that we have some sort of widespread insider threat phenomenon. I certainly would never claim that. I am emphatically declaring that we have a significant rift in the ranks. This rift is better envisioned as a deep moral chasm. How can we bridge that moral gap? How can the military atone for what has happened, for what it has perpetrated against its own troops? Absent that, how can restitution occur? How can the military fix itself? Is it even possible? While I might concede that the military may be fixable, I don't think it can fix itself. That's why I decided to resign. That's why I have not even considered going back. All right, returning here to the piece. Many of the senior Department of Defense leaders need to leave the service immediately. As for possible criminal prosecution for some of their actions, let the competent authorities, where they even exist, figure that out. The vast majority of currently serving commanders need to also be removed from their posts. Many of them need to be removed from the military as well. If they had any dignity whatsoever, they would resign, as I said earlier. The next thing that needs to happen is DOD's acknowledgement of COVID-19 injection injuries. DOD must admit that the injections have injured service members. Some have been so injured they can no longer serve. Adequate care and compensation must be allocated. This is not negotiable. All Americans can assist in this endeavor by doing everything possible to get Congress to act. Now, I realize that's much more, easier said than done. In fact, I go on to say the majority of members of Congress are even bigger cowards than military officers, so this will not be easy. However, we owe it to ourselves to pressure Congress to acknowledge what can no longer be hidden. If there remains any shred of character in the military at all, leaders need to recognize that those who resisted this tyranny are the true heroes. They never violated their oaths to the Constitution. They stood firm when nearly everyone else faltered. These individuals must be commended and made whole in terms of the harms that were inflicted to their careers. We need a wholesale reevaluation of our professional military education programs. It has clearly failed. Significant time and resources are invested into the education of leaders at all levels across the military. A portion of this education is centered on character, values, ethics, and morals. Clearly, this has been insufficient to provide the necessary framework for sound decision making. Many of these steps will be difficult. I'm not entirely sure they can be achieved, but we must try. If they are not achieved, then the moral injury will continue to deepen rather than heal, and along with it, the strategic damage will continue to grow. Now, that's the end of the piece. So, in summation, just a couple of thoughts. I am very, very hard on military commanders because military commanders are the ones that failed the most. And I'm not concerned about feelings here. As I said in the piece, command is not supposed to be easy. And if you thought it was going to be easy or you expected it to be easy, then you're not what the military needs in terms of command. And here's the other thing. There is a difference between making a mistake at a singular discrete moment in time through an action committed. We've all been there. We've all made mistakes, large or small. But it is much different to continue to make a mistake over long periods of time. And this is what military leaders, to include commanders, did. They made a mistake every day since the mandate went into effect that they did not stand up and resist it or somehow challenge it. Every day that they failed to do that, they were making the same mistake over and over and over again. I don't care that the mandate has been rescinded. I don't care that there's a new commander in chief. I don't care that there's a new secretary of defense. None of the fundamental problems are even being addressed, much less remedied. And they would be if people who went along with it would find their courage and would stand up and say, I can't believe I went along with this. I can't believe I wasn't courageous enough to stand up against this. I can't believe that we went along with this. Let's fix what we have done. But how many generals or admirals have stood up and said that? Zero. How many commanders, how many colonels or captains in the Navy, how many lieutenant colonels or commanders in the Navy have stood up and said, we own this. We are the ones who failed. We recognize what we did. We recognize that we were a part of it. We recognize that there was a massive institutional failure. We've got to fix this. But they don't stand up and say that because they're complicit in that. And I will tell you, I have friends of mine, people that I think are good people, but they are complicit in allowing this to happen. I have people of mine who were roommates from West Point, complicit in allowing this to happen. I have people that are, again, I consider these to be good people, good dudes, but here they absolutely failed. And this failure is not insignificant. Americans have died. Many Americans have died because of the COVID op. And if you were a military leader or you were a commander in a unit during the time in which this mandate went into effect, if you didn't stand up and resist it, then you were complicit in the overall COVID op that has resulted in the deaths of Americans, in the plunder of how many Americans' wealth, in the injury, physical and moral, to Americans. It is unconscionable. So this is the state of our military. Now, maybe I'm getting a little bit energized about this, but it's because I don't see enough Americans standing up and saying, what the hell happened over the last couple of years? Now, there are some, but in our military, there are virtually none. Not at the senior ranks, not in command billets. And that is a problem. And until fundamental changes occur within the military, the American public must consider the military to be its enemy in the same way that they must consider the greater American government to be its enemy. Why? Because the actions that the government, to include the Department of Defense, have committed over the last couple of years are the actions that only an enemy would perpetrate against the American public. It's fundamental that you know that. And if you wear the military uniform, it's also much more important that you understand that you work for enemies of the American people. It is what it is. I'm not saying that every person who wears the uniform is an enemy to the American people. I'm not saying that. But in the collective, the institution is. And you can fight with me all you want on that, but we saw what happened over the last couple of years. So get your head out of the sand and realize if we don't fix what happened, it will happen again. And when it happens again, the military will be part of it. Thank you. I appreciate you following along.